So I'm going to present the paper, You Are the One That I Want, Public Employment and Women's Labor Market Outcomes, jointly with Zoe Kuehn in Madrid. And this paper starts with the fact that public employment is more relevant for women, or in other words, there is an overrepresentation of women in public employment. And you can see this in two different angles. One is to look at the share of employment in women that is public employment relative to the share of public employment in men's. And this is presented in the left-hand side. And we see that in United States, United Kingdom, France, and Spain, the public employment represents a larger share of employment in women than men, sometimes double. Another way to look at it is to look at the composition of public employment and see what's the fraction of women relative to the fraction of women in private sector employment. These are just two sides of the same coin. So this paper, we want to answer the question, why do women want to work in the public sector? And here there is kind of a first answer that's usually anecdotally kind of the main think about as one of potentially main explanation is that women have an intrinsic preference for public sector occupations. So they prefer to be doctors, nurses, and teachers, or they prefer an occupations for the common good. And whether we can think about this as the first benchmark, we think there are other reasons for women to prefer to work in the public sector that are due to characteristics of public sector employment, of human resource practices in the public sector that work as a magnet that's stronger for women than for men. And we think about mainly three things. So one is the fact that women face lower gender wage gaps in the public sector, or in other words, the public sector wage premium is higher for women than for men. But also the better work-life balance or higher job security. So our main objective is to try to distinguish between these four explanations. So in the first part of the paper, we document empirical evidence. We go to microdata for the US, UK, France, and Spain, and we show evidence on the stocks and flows from public and private sector employment, but also the flows to inactivity or unemployment, differences in wages and hours worked. And then we build a quantitative search and matching model. So here we'll have men and women and decide to enter the private or the public sector labor market, and within they'll have also the choice of whether to participate or withdraw from the labor force. So there will be employment, unemployment, and inactivity. So you can think about the 2 times 2 times 3. So it merges what is the seminal work by Garibaldi and Wasmer with a three-state labor market with Albanese and Sain that extended that to men and women, but also with Gomes with the public sector. We use the data to calibrate the model for these 4 countries, and we do these 3 exercises. So first and mainly decompose the women's selection to these 4 possibilities. Then we use the model to calculate the public sector job security and work-life balance premia. So the model can tell us how much would private sector workers be willing to sacrifice of their wage for the same job security as the public sector or the same work-life balance. And then finally, we can measure the asymmetric gender effects of public policy. Okay, so when we go to the data, we compute 2 statistics, which are basically the ratios of the bars that you've seen in the first picture. So we have the ratio of public employment shares, the share of women's, the public sector in women's employment, divided by the share of public out of men's employment, or the ratio of women's employment share. So the fraction of women in the public sector divided by the fraction of women in the private. And all of these, so we prefer this because there is a natural benchmark. If everything was symmetric, we would have the value of 1. Now we show evidence that this overrepresentation is robust over time, age groups, region, education, but we also separate between industries. So we take out health and education, and we find that although it's lower, this education, but this gender bias is still there, and it's still there within, for instance, the education industry. So it hints there's more to it. We also go to occupations, three-digit occupations that are common in the US, that are common between public and private sector. And we find that in more than 2/3 of those, close to 70% of occupations, is this gender overrepresentation. And so we think that the story of preferences is certainly there, but we think there's more to it, and that's what we want to investigate with a model. Now, the model will be a search and matching model. So in the heart, there's this flows between employment, unemployment, and inactivity. So we document the statistics on the stocks. So we find, for instance, inactivity rates are higher for women, and for instance, they are twice as high in Spain and in the US. But crucially and important for the calibration of the model, for the identification of the mechanisms, we need the transition probabilities. So in particular, we find that the probability of exiting the labor force is lower if for public sector workers. Public sector workers are less likely to withdraw from the labor force, and this is particularly true in Spain, and it's particularly true for women. It's more you see it observed in both genders, but mainly for women, and this is going to be an important statistic. Because our identification of work-life balance comes from these differences in the exiting of the labor force, from the labor force. Then we also estimate the public sector wage premium. There's countless numbers of empirical papers that do it. They all find this asymmetry that the public sector wage premium is higher. For women, we find these numbers -5% in the US, -5% for men, 6% for women. In Spain, 0% for men, 7% for women. In both countries, there is a substantial gender wage gap in the private sector, 30% in the US, 20% in Spain. This is larger than the usually documented because we consider gross yearly earnings, which is the best mapping to the model. So here it is. So this kind of how we identify these four effects. Well, the lower gender wage gaps, we match them directly to the public sector wage premium we find in the literature. And also the job security, we match the flows from public and private employment to unemployment. The better work-life balance, it's not going to be it's going to be captured indirectly with the lower flows from employment to inactivity for women in the public compared to private sector. So we attribute the better work-life balance. It's everything that prevents men and women to exit the labor market to inactivity. That's better in the public sector than the private. And the preference is the residual. It's everything we don't capture. So it could be differences in risk aversion or differences in preference for different occupations. Okay, so the model, it's a search and matching model. There will be men and women, MF, and public and private sector. So G for government, P for private. Continuous time, risk-neutral agents with a discount rate of R. In each instant, there is, at a certain rate, tau individuals die or exited the labor force, and the new generation is born or joined the labor market. When they are born, they draw a preference, epsilon, for the public sector with a certain distribution that's different for men and women, and it can be negative, so you can be a distaste for the public sector. We join the so then the decision for this newborn is to join the public sector. If epsilon is large enough, they'll join the private sector otherwise. In each market, people can be employed, unemployed, or inactive. So there will be three states. So you can see this in this diagram, and there will be a fraction whose preferences are high enough to join the public, and the remaining goes to the private. And then there will be a three states market, and these are segmented. So markets are segmented, and the decision is ex ante. So you can think about it as an occupational choice. Now, during their life at rate lambda, they draw an X, which is the value of home production. And these distributions are potentially different from men and women. Women, for cultural reasons or for different reasons, they might have draw this value of home production larger than men due to childbirth, etc. Now the flows, the flow utilities, if you are inactive, you just enjoy benefit from the value of home production. If you are unemployed, you have to spend some time searching, which eats away part of the home production. And if you are employed, well, you'll also have an epsilon that it will eat away on your X, and this is potentially different across sectors, but then you enjoy the wage, you benefit from the wage. And it's this time cost, this difference that we'll think about as work-life life balance. Differences in epsilon means that maintaining the job, you can still benefit from the home production. You can pick up the kids from school, you can take care of your parents. There's exogenous separations that differ across sectors and gender. And so within we have the value functions. I won't show, but solving these models when you have within each public or private, you have a three-state labor market. So we follow Garibaldi and Wasmer, and there the key is to identify these cutoffs. The cutoff XA, when it's very large home production, people just become inactive. And they quit their employment, become inactive. There is another cutoff, which is when you are unemployed, above which the value of X, you just stop looking and you become inactive. And because of this kink, there is also a kink on the value of employment. So there will be what's called the employed attached, that if they lose their job, they'll become unemployed. But there will be the employed unattached, meaning that if they exogenously lose their job, they prefer to go to inactivity. So we can calculate these cutoffs, and what we find is that one relation between lower wages and higher inactivity. So if wages are lower, then this cutoff is also lower. So more people, everything else equal, a higher level of X would propel them to go to inactivity. So we think there is one link between gender wage gaps and higher inactivity rates for women. Now, this is how a labor market would look like and how the flows would look. And here we have to distinguish between these two groups of employed, attached and unattached. And the difference is that if they are attached, if they face separation shock, they'll become unemployed. If they are not attached, if they face an exogenous separation void, they go to inactivity. And here, so this is for an individual agent. Then here is for the whole labor market, you'll have men and women coinciding in the search. We assume that the job, we assume and find that in equilibrium, firms don't have any incentive to discriminate on hire, so the job finding probability is the same for men and women, but then job separation, quit rates might be different. So in the end, the composition of men and women reflect the composition of men and women in the labor market, in particular in unemployment. Okay, so on the private sector, just on the importance of the wage determination. So we think about the private sector firms. There's a simple sharing rule. Men just have a fraction B of whatever their productivity. So here we try to make it very simple. So then the wages of male are essentially taken as exogenous, and everything is how the wages in public employment, men and women, are going to change. So that we can calculate the value of a male job for a private sector firm, and for women, wage determination will follow Albanese and Sahim, and we really like this idea that firms they want to have the same value of a job for a man and a woman. And what this implies that firms will pay less to women if they anticipate they are more likely to quit from to inactivity. So if women are more likely to quit, the expected duration of the match is lower. So then firms are going to pay a lower wage to compensate, so that they are indifferent between hiring a man and a woman. And this generates an endogenous gender wage gap, and creates a link between higher inactivity for women to lower wages. Now, the potential problem is that quantitatively, we don't know if this is enough to get the right gender wage gaps. So we also introduce an exogenous element, what we call a wedge. So this comes from the misallocation literature. It's a wedge on women's wages. So is the W star is the wage that firms pay, but then women only receive a fraction 1 minus alpha. And this is a tax. We don't know where it comes from. It's everything that contributes to the gender wage gap. An alternative would be just to consider that their productivity is lower than men, but in practice, in the model, it's essentially the same, and we find that in this way, it's more agnostic way to put it. So we can calculate the value of vacancy and the free entry condition that pins down the tightness in the private sector, and we can see that this tightness, and this is very typical of these segmented market models, the public sector employment and wages do not affect the tightness and the wages in the private sector. And how it affects, how public employment and wage policies affect, is through the scale of the private sector. So it's this, if wages are very high in the public and you have more people queuing for public sector jobs, then the scale of the private sector is going to run at a lower scale, so fewer unemployed queuing for the private sector, so vacancies go down 1 to 1. On the public sector, there's going to be an exogenous premium that we are going to match the data. So wages themselves are endogenous in the way, but the premium is exogenous, and the public sector has to employ a certain number of workers for it to run. So the only really decision, or the only thing the governments have to do, is to hire workers to replace the ones that retire or the ones that separate to unemployment and inactivity. And this is not super straightforward, because the quits from the public sector depends on the gender composition, but we can calculate the vacancies needed to replace hiring. We assume, without a loss of generality, and the minimum the matching function is the minimum between vacancies and unemployed. And so it doesn't mean there's no such frictions, but they are one-sided. It's only on the side of the unemployed. Okay, so then we have the initial choice of sector, and this is important for two reasons. So one is, in the absence of this, what would happen, the different incentives for men and women, it would imply that we only have corner solutions. So if all the incentives were perfectly symmetric, then the composition of men and women in the two sectors would be undetermined. If there, for example, the public sector benefited slightly women, for instance, with a higher public sector wage premium, then you'll have more women wanting to go to the public sector. This would reduce the probability of finding a job for both men and women, so men wouldn't want and would go to the private. And then you would only have one equilibrium where only women work in the public and only men work in the private. And so what this preference, this initial preference, means that you won't have this bang bang, that you'll always have men that are passionate about the public sector that will join the public sector, and you always have women that won't join. So in a way, it breaks this bang bang and the corner solution. So what we'll find is that incentives will matter, and the incentives that will from better work-life balance or better higher wages will affect men and women differently and will feed back into their cutoffs. So just summarizing, there's difference between men and women in the value of home production. So women might have draw from distribution of X to the shift to the right. They might have different preferences for the public sector, and women have a wedge on female wages that men don't. The difference across sectors is the time cost, this on I, the exogenous separation rate, and the wages. That will be different across sectors. Now, because this 30-minute presentation, I won't talk much about the calibration. We do it separately for these 4 countries. We fix 9 parameters. We calibrate 16 with 17 targets, and we use so we use different targets. We do have a very tight identification in terms of variation of. So one important parameter that you can't really pin down just with steady state variables is just with one steady state is this distribution, the variance of the distribution of preferences. And we use regional variation to get an idea for that. Okay, so here's the main table. This is what's the benchmark public employment shares ratio for the different countries. What would be if there were no sector differences and no preference differences, then we would actually should observe that women are underrepresented in public employment because they're also underrepresented in private employment because there would be higher inactivity rates. So we want to explain these differences based on the preferences, the wages, the time costs, and the job security. And what we find that preferences indeed matter and matter particularly high for the UK, but then this role of differences is of the public sector characteristics is also important. So the wages, the different wage premiums explain 30% of the selection into the US, 54 in Spain, and also about 30% in Spain, and 50 in France, sorry. The work-life balance contributes 20% to France and 30% to Spain. If you've been to Spain, you know that in the summer, public sector workers finish working at 3 p.m. And it's this type, so the fact that it's very high for Spain is not really surprising. What's perhaps surprising is that the job security difference actually has a negative effect. So it contributes to attract more men than women. And this is due because men, they have higher wages than women, and they have lower outside options on average. So this means that they value more job security than women. So a private sector worker would be willing to sacrifice more of their wages. So this is what we try to do in the second quantitative exercise, is try to calculate the work-life balance and the job security premia. So this is the percentage of wage private sector workers would sacrifice for the public sector time costs of working. So this will be different depending on their on the X they have. So we have to integrate over X, but we find that it's in the US it's rather small. It's about 3%. In US and UK and France, it's up to 12% to women, around 7-8% for men, and in Spain is huge 40% for women and 24% for men, which is quite huge. We can do the same, but with the job separation rate, how much would private sector workers sacrifice their wage to have the same job separation rates as the public sector? And we find that this is small in US and UK, about 1 to 2%, again higher for men, because they have lower unemployment rates than compared to France or Spain, where it's between 2 to 4%. Again, it's men are willing to pay more for more job security. And then finally, I'll just put for Spain, but it's across all countries, public employment policies or wage policies have higher effects on women's labor market. So the effect on the unemployment rate is twice as high. So higher public sector wages tends to increase unemployment, but twice as much for females than for males. An increase in employment by 1% tends to reduce the unemployment rate because there is a direct employment effect, and it's again twice as stronger for women. And this is it. So we find that preferences matter a lot, especially in the UK, but it's really substantial, the role of work-life balance and different gender wage gaps. And we find that there is no role for job security in explaining why women prefer the public sector. What we can do is that calculate the monetary value, and we find especially the work balance premia is very high, and it's particularly valued by women. And the future research, if you think, would be to include risk aversion, and we think that it would most likely increase the job security premium. And if women are in fact more risk averse than men, it might also contribute to their to attract more women to the public sector.